Well, welcome everyone this afternoon to this webinar in our Insight 2020 series. And as you can see, our theme for this afternoon is the NHS as an anchor. So exploring the concept of the NHS as an anchor institution. And this afternoon, we're giving some time to sharing experience for what that means in different places around the country. And how decisions can be better shaped using anchor perspectives. Don't worry that the time on that slide says 10 o'clock. We haven't all time travelled, even if you have been staying up all night trying to keep track of election results, but we'll try and take your minds off that for an hour this afternoon. My name is David Fritz from the strategy unit, and I have the pleasure and privilege to be involved in lots of our work around the economic impact of the NHS. But my role today is largely, and with great pleasure, to introduce some colleagues from the Health Foundation who are particularly involved in the running of the anchor network that the Health Foundation is now running nationally. In a moment, I'll hand over to Jenna and to colleagues Mimi and Matilda, but a big thank you for joining us today and for leading us through this conversation. Just a few bits of housekeeping before I do that. Please do keep your microphone muted during the session. If you haven't already introduced yourselves to each other through this chat function, please do that as we get going, and then continue to use the chat box for asking any questions or raising any issues, and my colleague Janine will be keeping an eagle eye on that. Sessions are being recorded and that's already underway, and so we'll be able to send you a link afterwards so you can continue to benefit from the conversation. And do also please feel free to tweet about what you hear. So with no further ado for me, I'm going to hand over to Jenna to take us through this afternoon's session.
Fantastic, thanks so much, David. And you should be able to see our lovely slides. So hi everyone, thanks so much for taking the time to come to this session. As David said, it's me, Matilda, and my colleague Mimi. You might hear me say the phrase "next slide please," and I'm incredibly sorry about that, but next slide please, Mimi. Yeah, so that's us. So we make up a part of the Anchors team at the Health Foundation. So David covered off a bit of the housekeeping, but I guess one other thing just to mention is we will be dabbling with Slido during the presentation, so don't worry, we'll put the code up throughout when we use it, but just so you're warned that we will be kind of using that for a bit of quiz and a bit of polling, and to get some of your thoughts and reflections. We can move on to the next slide. So we have just about 55 minutes today to talk about, as David said, about anchors. And I guess what we'll start with is, what do we mean by the term anchor, acknowledging that some people might be more familiar with the term than others, and thinking about, how we can measure its impact. We'll also be sharing some of the insights that we're hearing from anchor institutions across the UK, and how their anchor work has adapted and changed in light of COVID. And we'll also talk about some of the more practical things that we're doing. So as David mentioned, we've just started designing a UK-wide anchors learning network. So it'd be good to talk a little bit about that and some of the ways in which you might want to be involved in that work. And most importantly, I guess, a chance to just reflect and for you to consider how this might link to some of the work that you're doing. Thanks, Mimi. So in terms of then what we mean by the word anchor and anchor institutions, evidence tells us that the most important determinants of population health are influenced by factors outside the health system, and I'm sure many of you are aware of this. And while it's really important that the NHS provides kind of safe and effective and timely care, actually we know that clinical care alone won't make us healthy. And in fact, it only makes up 10 to 20% of what makes us healthy. So that we know that the NHS has an important influence on the wider conditions that make us healthy in the first place. So the term anchor institution in and of itself isn't that new. There are other organisations such as universities who are a bit more advanced in their thinking about what we mean by the term anchor. But essentially they are large organisations that have a significant stake in a geographical area, and they have sizable assets that can be used to support the local community. So the Health Foundation, as are many other organisations, have been doing thinking around how can the NHS and health and care organisations really lean in and embrace its role as an anchor institution and influence those wider determinants of health. So during this presentation, we might talk about anchor strategies or anchor practice, so slightly different terms, but essentially kind of coming back to the same thing about how can the NHS really use its assets to influence those wider determinants. I guess like related and connected terms also include things like the NHS's role in community wealth building, social value, inclusive growth. There are kind of nuances within these terms, but I guess they sit on like a similar spectrum of similar and connected themes about that kind of those wider determinants of health. Move on to the next slide. So in 2019, the Health Foundation did quite a chunky report on the NHS as an anchor institution, and came up with these, through the research, these 5 pillars, if you like, of what it means for the NHS to be an anchor. And we'll talk about some of these in a bit more detail when we kind of talk about some of the examples of what we're seeing and hearing in practice. But essentially, we think the key areas where the NHS can really leverage its assets include purchasing more locally for social benefit, thinking about creative use of space in estates that it has access to. I think workforce and the quality of work and kind of local employment issues are really going to be important, particularly in kind of COVID recovery, and reducing its environmental impact. Even though kind of the partnership pillar kind of sits alongside these, actually it kind of underpins a lot of this work as well in terms of how the NHS works with others. So if we move on to the next slide, I think this will hopefully kind of come through throughout this session, but I appreciate that up until now it might feel a bit abstract, but there are some really tangible and amazing work that the NHS is doing on this agenda. So in terms of what that might look like in practice, it could be kind of workforce schemes in terms of being a living wage employer, or running apprenticeship schemes that are targeted for like local people or for particular groups in local communities. I think particularly again with COVID and PPE, we're seeing some interesting innovation around kind of local supply chains, for example. So there really is kind of a massive menu of ideas and innovation that's happening in this space. So if we move on to the next slide, which is quick quiz to get us kind of warmed up. So how much does the NHS spend on general supplies, equipment and services each year? So if you pop onto Slido, what do we think that number is? All the results are coming in. Okay, well, the majority of you are actually correct. It is, in fact, £27 billion. So a lot of money. And then when you think about, you know, how are we spending that? Who are we spending it with? And how are we using that money in a way to kind of help the local economy or to help local businesses? The potential there is pretty massive. So if we move on to the next slide. So I guess just to kind of pull this kind of intro piece together and linking it back to the Insight 2020 event and making those connections between insight and learning and analysis, which I know as part of this festival many of you have been thinking about. There is kind of a real diversity and energy to get stuff done in this space. So a really interesting opportunity right now to kind of start sharing that learning and insights around anchors. And I think a really interesting opportunity to start influencing decision makers to make those strategic choices about their anchor work and some of the anchor approaches they might want to take up going forward. We know that anchor work can play a significant role in COVID-19 recovery, as well as impacting on the wider determinants of health. But we also know that, you know, people are on a journey with this. Some people are a bit more advanced than others. And there's still lots that we need to get our heads around. So impact and measuring anchor work is definitely one of those areas, and I'm sure we'll kind of touch on that. But also things like, implementation, spread. So it's really great to share some of that thinking with you, and think about the ways in which we can continue this conversation beyond the session today. So I think I'm now handing over to my colleagues for the next bit.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks a lot, Jenna. Hi, everyone. I'm Mimi. So in the next kind of session, we wanted to focus a little bit more on what we have been doing at the Health Foundation. And part of this is a series of anchoring COVID-19 conversations we've held in different regions over the past couple of months. Before I do that, I just want everyone to try and think back to kind of pre-COVID times, winter last year, early this year, to try and get a sense of who's in the room. So if you could head back to Slido, use the event code 411-2020 again, and just select on a scale of 1 to 10, how developed you think your institution's anchor activities are. And this could be the kind of organisation you work at as a whole, or particular projects you've been involved in. And we've got 1 in a, this is all completely new to you and Jenna's introduction was really helpful, or 10 where you're an absolute expert and we should be asking you some questions. So I'll just activate the slide go now, and we'll wait for the results to come through. That's great. So I think around half of people have voted so far. And at the moment, there seems to be a really good mix, a kind of changing mix, but the kind of sense in the room is that we're around a 3, so towards the lower end, especially pre-COVID. So at the start of COVID, conversations started to happen around whether or not we thought the anchors agenda in our report published last year would have a kind of greater impact or less of an impact due to the challenges faced. And Matilda and Dominique published a blog which is on our website, and the references there kind of talking about potentially some of the new opportunities that are faced due to COVID. And some of the conversations we've had have definitely highlighted that, in particular from a kind of working with local organisations, local businesses to refine supply chains. There's been a lot of involvement with the voluntary and community sector, and also a lot of interest in working in the NHS. So we think there's lots of kind of new opportunities out there. COVID has naturally brought up a lot of challenges, and there's been a challenge just with having increased kind of public awareness of what's going on, but also increased centralisation of the NHS and kind of who's in charge, who's making the decisions. We've also thought a lot about the kind of priorities, and obviously BAME communities have been disproportionately affected, and we think COVID has widened health inequalities, so there's been a focus on that. Also around kind of huge unemployment levels and the burden of COVID, especially in high risk areas, and whether or not utilising the kind of anchor framework and anchor concept can make a difference is also something that we were kind of interested in when we started this. So we've held a series of anchor and COVID-19 conversations kind of dotted around the country. You can see on the map, we've got green stars where we've already held conversations, and yellow stars where we're yet to kind of engage with local areas. And we've tended to stick with an NHS local partner who's kind of worked on convening the conversation, but we've extended the invites to kind of the wider community sector, especially higher education. We had the police on a call this morning, also to kind of local authority and the voluntary sector. So I'm just going to hand over to Matilda now, I think, to just tell you a little bit more about some of the themes that have been coming out from these conversations.
Thanks very much, Mimi. Yeah, so it's been a really exciting project so far, and we've had kind of between 10 and 30 people on each call taking this place-based approach and talking about where is the anchor agenda up to at the moment for them. And as I'm going through these, it would be great to get a sense from you, either in the chat or when we get to the discussion section, if this kind of chimes with the work that you're involved with locally, if you're seeing totally different kind of priority areas in your anchor type activity, or if you have kind of anything to add to these. So I'd say our emerging key themes is kind of underlying all of this work. There's 2 real motivations for action. As Mimi has mentioned, COVID-19 has had a kind of range of health and wellbeing impacts aside from just the direct morbidity and mortality of COVID itself. We're seeing that right through from the kind of wider determinants, things like employment, education, early years, income, how those have been impacted by COVID, and particularly for already disadvantaged communities, and how that might increase inequalities and in turn increase health inequalities. And also kind of more direct health impacts on things like mental health and lifestyle. But what we're really seeing is these two factors coming together. So a concern for inequalities and a kind of burning platform created by COVID-19 and some of the wider economic and social effects that we're seeing, particularly for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged in our society. I think inequalities, you know, I'm a public health person, this is kind of bread and butter, but I think for a lot of people who work in the NHS, there's an increasing focus on really the kind of root causes of inequalities. And that's, for me, what this Anchors agenda is all about, is bringing the NHS back a bit towards prevention, towards population health, towards thinking about their populations and their needs and assets and experiences and priorities, rather than just the individual patient coming through the front door. In terms of priority areas for action, we've mentioned most of these already, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but I think the real kind of priority areas are increasing unemployment, and that's kind of expanding the viewpoint, I think, earlier on. So thinking about working with young people, working with schools, colleges and universities, rather than just putting out a job advert and hoping that, you know, the local people who really need jobs apply for it. Obviously through recruitment and that phase, but also looking further ahead to progression within health and social care careers and how people's health and wellbeing can be supported through their experiences at work. And we're seeing a focus not only on youth unemployment, but also supporting and bringing into the health and social care sector those who might have lost jobs in other industries that have been particularly hard hit by COVID and its wider impacts, and how that can help perhaps those who aren't young people but have worked in another industry for many years and are now facing unemployment, and how they can be supported into the NHS in particular, considering the jobs in the NHS are not being cut in the same way as they are in some other industries. We've heard a bit about procurement and social value, building social value into all contracts and procurement decisions and maximising that and measuring it, which I think different places are on different kind of maturity of that, and working around national procurement rules as well. And then sustainability, innovation and digital technology, and really how can we harness some of the shifts towards digital that we've seen in COVID in order to also benefit sustainability agenda and think differently about how we both deliver services and engage with communities. In terms of cross-cutting issues, we've heard quite a lot about, it's fine to kind of say you're an anchor, and it's a bit of a kind of buzzword at the moment. But really, how do we scale this up across areas? How do we ensure that it has depth? And by that, I mean it has measurable impact on communities, on the things that matter for them, and it's tackling inequalities. And I think that's going far further and actually really important for the kind of analysis and measurement agenda, rather than just saying we're an anchor and then being done with it. Obviously aligned with that is a real need for collaboration and integration in order to achieve that. And then also we've heard a lot and we've been thinking quite a lot about what happens at different levels. So what is the role of an anchor institution compared to an anchor partnership working in place, compared to a system, maybe an ICS or an STP in their role, compared to regionally, and then moving on to nationally, what's needed nationally. Next slide, please, maybe. This is just some of the, so when we've done our local conversations, we've asked people to submit how they would describe their local partnerships on Slido and made some word clouds. I'm not going to go through these in detail, but I think it's just quite illustrative that actually they're quite similar across areas, and these 4 areas we've spoken to are very different in context, but the partnerships, some are further developed than others, but actually we're hearing a lot of the similar kind of words. You know, they're promising, they're inclusive, but they're still emerging, they're a bit disjointed, they're fragmented, they need to progress, they're small scale, and I think it's kind of quite striking in a way how similar some of those are between very different places across the UK in terms of that anchor work. Next slide, please. So I'm going to move on to a kind of a bit of a focus on analysis. I'm going to give one intro slide and then I'm going to hand over to David. So this is just, I've just pulled out a couple of the reflections from this work that we've been doing with local areas about what they've been saying about analysis and about metrics and measurement in this area. I think first of all, in terms of functions, this is kind of bread and butter stuff, but we've heard how people are using analysis, both for identifying what the local needs, priorities and assets are, for making a business case for action. I'll let David talk more about that. For identifying a baseline and then shared metrics for progress. It sounds simple, but I think a lot of areas are still at that point of, you know, where are we, where do we want to go, and how do we share these metrics between different organisations across the local area. And then, of course, for evaluation at different levels. The overall, the general feedback, simplifying quite a lot, is the data exists. We don't necessarily need to go and collect more data. It's about, and people are already doing analysis, it's more about how is it being used, what are different institutions doing, how are they bringing data together, and I think how they're using it strategically and aligning it with the anchor's mission, and also just a point in there about how to include economic costings in there, which I think is not particularly well developed across the UK. Next slide, please. This is David's bit. I'm going to hand over to him and he's going to give us a kind of much more concrete examples about using analysis in terms of anchor work and decision making.
Thank you, Matilda. Absolutely, and this will align very much with the emerging themes that you've been sharing from other places around the country. So that's very encouraging to hear. There's a number of things I want to do very quickly in this part. One is I'm going to kind of offer a framework for different types of decision making with the help of a number of equine friends we'll see in a moment. And then to give just a couple of examples from some of the recent work that we've been doing at the strategy unit in this area. And then to end really with a plea for your ideas as to how we can make sure we're undertaking and joining up more appropriate analysis to support a different kind of decision making across our systems. So thank you, Mimi. If we could move on to the equine friends. So, you know, many of the things that we're involved with in our systems and organisations are things where there's a pretty clear goal, a contained environment. We know what the boundaries of it are, a relatively short-term focus. And in those contexts, it's right that we put the blinkers on, or in the case of this neat little blue outfit, ear covers as well. I'm not sure what the technical name is, but we don't want to be distracted. We know what needs to be done, and we just have to get on and do it. And thinking clinically, you know, maybe an example of that would be the paramedics that turn up at a road traffic accident. They know what needs to be done, the assessments they need to make, the treatment options they've got, and in front of them is simply a critical patient. The wider context of that patient's life are not relevant there and then in that moment. But there'll be other contexts which are quite different, where there isn't such a narrowly defined single goal, where the environment is much more open and there are all kinds of emerging challenges and opportunities, and there's a longer term focus. And in an environment like that, we need all the senses to be alert to what's going on around us. And maybe a clinical example of that might be more akin to the primary care management of long-term conditions, and to a kind of really holistic approach being taken to that, going far beyond the medical into the social, taking full account of what really matters to the person and their family, etc. But going beyond the clinical, the wider decisions that we make in healthcare can also fall one side of the dotted line I've got here on the slide. We kind of have a choice as to which way we go. And sometimes it will absolutely be right to put the blinkers on and go on the left-hand side there. But with a lot of these issues we're dealing with, there are many more opportunities to push ourselves towards the right-hand side rather more. Matilda touched earlier on the kind of recruitment and employment question, and I entirely agree of how significant that's becoming. We can take a very blinkered approach, and historically we have, where we've had shortages. We've undertaken different innovations in recruitment. We've gone to Spain, we've gone to Portugal, we've gone to Philippines, we've gone as far as we need to kind of raid from the world the people that we think we need. And yet in many cases we're in communities of significant deprivation, with people who could well do with those jobs if they could somehow be supported into them. It won't always be possible, won't always be appropriate or desirable, but I suggest there have to be real opportunities there when we take an unblinkered view at these, look at these kind of issues. And similarly with procurement, do you treat that simply as a, well, what's the quickest and cheapest way in which I can get what I want? Or do you think about what the economic impact of those decisions, and therefore the employment impact, and therefore the health impact of that decision might be on the health of the population that you're caring for in your system and organisation? And similar questions can be raised around estates and much more broadly about the health and well-being of the population. So if we can just go on from that, Mimi, just a couple of examples where there is the potential, I want to suggest, to move towards unblinkered decision making through reframing the baseline information we work with, and then reframing the choices so that we give decision makers the opportunity to make different choices. And there's just a link at the bottom of this slide as an example to the New Zealand government's living standards framework, which I think is a really interesting example of doing that, moving away from a pure kind of cost effectiveness assessment of policy interventions to a much more balanced approach. So if we go on then to just a couple of slides from work we've been privileged to do recently in the Hereford and Worcestershire system. First of all, looking at their baseline economic impact. Not the amount of money here that the NHS is investing or spending in that area, but the value, the economic value it is generating there. Here you see listed as about 1.5 billion. But not confining the frame of reference either simply to formal NHS expenditure. Part of what is spent on health and care is what people provide for family and friends informally. And estimating that by two different measures, it ranges from nearly 700 million to 1.4 billion again. That system's impact on its local economy also involves 34,000 full-time equivalent jobs. And it's a system which bears substantial direct and indirect costs of ill health, costs which don't simply fall on the NHS in terms of service provision. And the next slide just illustrates that in a little more detail. This example is from the costs of anxiety and depression in the system. We're most used to focusing on the right-hand side, and perhaps we might call that the more blinkered approach. Direct costs in that area of 175 million, broken down by various sort of points of delivery. And traditionally we might look at, well, how can we apply a kind of left shift principle in there and get things more out of hospital on an assumption that that will be cheaper. But if we take the unblinkered approach and we start to look at what are the other impacts of that ill health, well, very substantially, particularly with anxiety and depression, is the impact on people's productivity at work, not least through not being able to be at work. And our estimates in this case was that cost would be in the region of 223 million, so more than the direct cost of healthcare delivery. And our argument here is that in taking this unblinkered approach and taking a wider view of the impacts of what we do, opens up new possibilities decision making and new ways of thinking. If we could go on, please. One of the things we then looked at with the help from Worcestershire system was what benefits could be achieved by moving more to virtual outpatient appointments. This, of course, now feels very much like old hat after the last 6 months, and you might just remember that, say 9 months ago, we were all still wondering, well, would we ever manage a real shift towards virtual outpatients? So it is encouraging how quickly things can move. But this analysis was designed to help that move pre-COVID. And the analysis that we undertook with some fairly conservative assumptions at that point about moving to virtual outpatient appointments was, as you see from this illustration, and starting on the road, about 2.8 million less miles would be travelled. Costs borne by patients in travel, etc., of nearly £1 million. Local economic value increasing by 2.6 million from avoiding the productivity that is currently lost, and a real environmental impact too, of quite significant reduction in emissions from the reductions in travel. And if we could go on again, and a second example that we looked at with them was the potential benefits from supporting informal carers. Again, a group that it's easy to be blind to as we're focused on treating the patients. But as this baseline analysis indicated, there is very significant value in the care that informal carers provide, which then enables us to open up the question, well, how could that be increased? And this model, which I won't go into the detail of now, looks at if there was investment in providing training and support to those carers, what benefits that might produce in a wider frame. Not just perhaps better care for those they're looking after, but the opportunities for those people to get back into work or to stay into work, for their own health and well-being to be improved. And there the benefits are multiple. If we could go on again, just to move quickly to an example from the Black Country and West Birmingham system. A lot of what we've been talking about has focused on, well, the blinkered approach starts on the right-hand side of this diagram. We accept population health status for what it is, and we think about how we best deliver in response to that. If we stretch that thinking a bit further, we start to think about the wider social, economic and environmental determinants. But this piece of work we just concluded with the Black Country and West Birmingham has stretched that further, as Matilda was indicating too, to think, well, what might be the impacts of the current pandemic on these dynamics? Not only the direct and indirect health impacts, but the socio-economic impacts and their impacts, their play through onto health as well. And just a quick summary in the next slides of what that analysis has shown us. So we took the economic scenarios from the Office for Budget Responsibility, in particular their unemployment estimates over the next 5 years in those scenarios, adjusted them for the historic differential there tends to be between Black Country and national rates. We then linked to those changes in unemployment rate, changes in health condition prevalence, based on research that was conducted for the Institute for Fiscal Studies from experience in the 2008 recession. And we were therefore able to show the potential demand pressures in a number of health conditions that could result from different levels of unemployment over the coming years, which are shown on the next slide. This is just in summary, though we've got a detailed breakdown and detailed models that can be analysed by place, by deprivation quintile, etc. The top there, you've got a grouping of the impact on the physical health conditions with at least a 6% impact, or at peak in the downside scenario, a 16% increase in physical health care and the demand for physical healthcare services, and more so in the mental health demand in the graph at the bottom, where it peaks potentially at 27% in 2021. And again, to highlight, these are the potential healthcare demand impacts simply of unemployment rate changes, based on that Institute for Fiscal Studies evidence, clearly increasing the challenge that there is felt, particularly in disadvantaged areas, and begging questions about what might an anchor institution be able to do to intervene in that cycle. What might we be able to do in the environments we're working within? And in particular, seems to us from this work that some of the key dynamics were around the cycle that leads from the extent to which children are or aren't ready for school, to the levels of skills and qualifications gained, to the extent and nature of employment, and onto income levels, and kind of background again. What can the NHS with other anchor institutions contribute to intervening in that cycle? And then just very quickly on the next slide is where we've tied that cycle to opportunities we've identified from local work, but also from those set out in the more recent Marmot 10 Years On review, which provides some really helpful material to help the local system think about how they might want to intervene together. So just a couple of quick examples there, and I just want to round off with my own kind of question for everyone around this on the final slide, Mimi, if we may. So to promote and embed this more unblinkered approach to decision making in organisations and systems, we need analysis that's helpful to decision makers and makes explicit to them, I suggest, though you're very welcome to disagree and to add, these three things. Things that help people understand the wider impacts of the things we've already decided, just the way we do things, because the way we do things now and the assumptions we make are having an impact. They do influence the socioeconomic and environmental circumstances in which we live and work as things stand. Then when we're coming to new decisions, or we've got decisions in process, they may be about service models, they may be about major capital decisions. What are the wider impacts of those, and how can we maximise the benefits of those? What analysis would help that, would help people to see things in a wider frame? And finally, not just thinking of how we can maybe adjust the kind of decisions we might anyway make in the NHS to have a greater, wider benefit. How can we work with partners to intervene in that cycle we were looking at on the previous slide, and to generate more benefit, both in terms of health and in terms of the socioeconomic determinants that contribute to that. So I'm encouraging a taking off of the blinkers, but I'm really looking for help from others, and not least from analytical colleagues, as to how we might help decision makers to do that. Matilda, is it back to you?
It's over to Jenna.
Jenna, sorry, Jenna.
Thanks so much. We thought we'd just now take literally a couple of minutes to get a bit of a temperature check, bit of a sense check. Appreciate that we've been talking for a while about anchors. So if we move on to the next slide, we're just going to do a very short activity, I'm going to do a variation, quite a big variation of a method called Mad Tea. And this is pulled from Liberating Structures, which I don't know if people have come across this before. It's something that we use in improvement quite a bit, particularly at the Health Foundation. But essentially it's a set of practical methods and tools for working in groups and teams to unleash ideas and opinions, but in a structured way, hence the name Liberating Structures. But if you're looking for ways to make Zooms kind of interesting and inclusive, please do feel free to go and take a look. But the activity we're going to do is essentially, I'm just going to read out a few statements. I'll do one at a time. And then on the chat, if you just kind of finish the sentence. So one example could be the weather today is, and then if you just write in the chat, great, sunny, rainy, or however it is that you're feeling. I hope that makes sense, but we'll keep it quite short. So my first question to you all is, the last 40 minutes of this session have been? Thought-provoking. That's a good answer, thank you. That's good. Honest feedback is very welcome. If I wasn't in this session, I would be. If I wasn't in this session, I would be. Yeah, I think the temptation not to look at the general election stuff is is real. And then something that resonated with me was. Something that resonated with me was. Thank you. And then finally, I hope the last 15 minutes of this session is. I hope the last 15 minutes of this session is. Okay, we're going down a singing route, it looks like. Thanks, everyone. Mimi, if we could just skip a few slides and I'll quickly take us through the Anchors Learning Network. If we move on to the next one. So very quickly, since 2019, the Health Foundation have been working in partnership with NHS England and NHS Improvement on Anchors, and essentially asking the key question of how can we best support NHS organisations and health and care organisations in their role as anchor institutions. So if we just move on to the next slide. So to do this, we're going to design and deliver an NHS Anchors Learning Network to support in this endeavour. And it'll essentially have three aims around building skills and capability, supporting a change in practice, and to increase the evidence base for anchor approaches. We'll move on to the next slide. Very quickly, why are we doing a network out of all the things that we can be doing to support organisations? But we know there are pockets of good practice, and in some cases there are local and regional networks already working together on this. And evidence tells us that peer learning is an effective mechanism for spreading ideas and good practice. So let's try and turbocharge anchor work where we can and support people and organisations to move forward on this agenda. And we think there's some really exciting opportunities for connecting people and organisations to spark further collaboration on some of these topics. So if we just move on to the next slide. So We've only just started designing the network. It still feels like quite an abstract concept in many ways, but we're essentially asking kind of all of the questions that you'd expect to when you're kind of at the beginning of a journey of designing a network. So who can be involved? What will it look like? What do we want to achieve? How can people join? Who can join? So I think a key question for us, particularly at this point and in this session, is how could an Anchors Learning Network support you and your work and the work that you're doing, particularly on the analysis front? If we just move on to the next slide, we'll be designing the network for the rest of the year, up until January next year, and then we're hoping to launch it in February 2021. And we'll pop some contact details at the end of these slides, but you're all very much invited to get involved if this feels like something that could really help and support you in your work, or if you're interested in this agenda.
That's great, thanks Jenna. So for the kind of final 10 to 12 minutes, we thought it would be quite good to get everyone to kind of reflect and discuss some of the issues that have come up, and obviously the last exercise was really good for some discussion in the chat box. As Matilda alluded to earlier, some of the anchoring COVID-19 conversations that we've had have kind of suggested some ways to move forward, both at a local organisation level and through the Anchors Learning Network, as kind of Jenna's just highlighted, but also kind of some asks that we might have from national policy. And what we'd really like to do is just kind of open it up to discussion and see what kind of you as the audience with your expertise think the next steps are or should be going forward. And I've just put some prompts kind of on the slide of things to think about that hopefully reflect some of the little pointers we've given today as well. So feel free to raise a hand and we can bring you into discussion and unmute, or use a chat box. We're happy with either. I might actually have to ask Matilda or Jenna to let me know if anyone's raising hands, because I don't think I can see that, but I've just got the chat box open, which is good.
That's fine. Maybe we could potentially stop sharing slides and then it might—
Yeah, that's a good idea.
See the room.
Is that—
Might we just ask Paul to speak to what he's put in the chat box?
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I was just wondering if the fact that COVID has highlighted or reminded people of health inequalities, or obviously it's not a new thing, but because it's, you know, does the COVID response create an opportunity for systems to buy into these ideas, or is it going to further shut them down? Because although the analysis is new and the framing in terms of anchor institutions is new, some of the underlying themes, particularly some of the work, the examples which David was presenting, are not new. And there's always this issue in the NHS about resources being spent on the immediate presenting issues and less on the sort of more long-term change. So yeah, is COVID going to be a barrier or an opportunity, I suppose?
Yeah, I can reflect briefly on that. I think so. I started off my career working with Michael Marmot on health inequalities and social determinants of health research, and I did that for years. And we did some work years ago about what health professionals in the health system can do on wider determinants of health. And I think the progression that has been made since then is actually huge. I think the conversations that are happening now were not happening 5 or 10 years ago within the NHS at all. And I think that from the places we've spoken to, COVID has only accelerated that shift, actually. However, I think there's a couple of potential barriers or caveats on that. First of all, we've mainly spoken to places that are interested in this. There's obviously some selection bias. And there are lots of places across the country where anchors just isn't really on the agenda. I guess my challenge back would be, or my kind of reflection on that would be, to me, speaking personally, I don't think it matters if you're calling it anchors, or if you're calling it tackling health inequalities, or if you're calling it population health or taking social determinants of health seriously or working with communities or community wealth building, as long as this shift is maintained. I think the other thing to mention is that working in partnership, a lot of local government and voluntary and community sector have been doing this work for a really long time. And sometimes when NHS joins the table and says, hey guys, have you heard about this thing called anchors, and now we can do like prevention, I think local government and voluntary community sector and some other partners are a bit like, yeah, we've been doing this for a long time already. And that doesn't necessarily foster fabulous partnerships, because it takes time to kind of build the same momentum and the same narrative and the same shared goals when some people feel like they're newer to this than others. So I think those are some kind of quite broad reflections, but I remain positive that this is a good moment for tackling health inequalities, and particularly a good moment for the NHS taking health inequalities, not just in outcomes, but really thinking about social determinants of health differently. I feel like that's a positive shift that's going to be maintained. Does anyone else have any reflections on that?
Just again, Matilda, to pick up the Marmot reference, and particularly in relation to the local authority dynamics you talked about, and noticing Claire's raising of the issues about non-NHS partners too. I just found it really helpful to use the kind of Marmot categorizations as a sort of neutral frame, because otherwise, as you say, the NHS appears like a child with a new toy, and thinking it's just discovered the answer, and can provoke bad reactions, and it can seem that it's all about the NHS agenda when local authorities are obviously going to be thinking anyway, but hang on, you've kept all the money and we haven't. So to have that kind of common agenda that's not owned by one party, and to be using that as a kind of framing device, I think is a really useful way ahead.
Thanks, David.
I think just tying that in, we've heard quite a lot that external organisations and other stakeholders find it quite difficult to collaborate and work with the NHS, and some of that has kind of been eased due to COVID, but equally that's still a big barrier and there is lots of red tape. And I was just wondering if anyone else has any reflections on kind of other barriers to kind of collaborating and sustainable partnerships going forward.
I was just gonna talk about the barrier that you've already been talking about. So.
That's fine, go for it.
My room is very dark and my lights are bright. I feel like I'm in some sort of strange environment, but anyway. No, I'm from a local authority background, public health local authority background. I was a public health epidemiologist, so all of the things you're saying about the slightly irksome NHS coming in and doing stuff and calling it new, I like the new toy thing. That all rings true, I think, not across the board, but that doesn't mean to say it shouldn't happen. And I do think you know, you had all those different ways of describing the same thing, Matilda, but population health management is something that we're really pushing here as well, and I think that is another very useful vehicle to try and achieve the same kind of things. That's all I was going to say, really. But it's a great talk. By the way, I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. I don't want to put you on the spot, Claire, but I wonder if you have any reflections on the work that you've been doing. No. Claire, I think Claire's got IT issues speaking, so I'll let her type in the chat box, but just because I know that she's been doing lots of really great work on this, so she will update in the chat box. I just have a kind of one further reflection. I don't know if anyone kind of finds this, is we kind of started, I think we started off these conversations really seeing not being sure what some of the kind of positive learning to come out of COVID was. And one of the things that we've heard again, well, two major things that we've heard again and again is firstly, community engagement and some of the kind of organising and action that happened at a community level during particularly the acute phase of COVID. I think the NHS and other partners has a lot to learn from, and actually, you know, understanding what the community is already doing rather than kind of starting from top down is absolutely essential. And the other thing that I wonder if anyone's kind of got a reflection on or experience of is we've heard quite a lot, oh, during COVID, we just got stuff done. Stuff that would have taken months normally and had to go to every board and every person and signed off twice and 3 times and 4 times. We just got in a room and we decided and then we did it because we had to. And I wonder if there's something now as we move forward about taking the best bits of that. Obviously, we need some governance and accountability and process because we, you know, that's the world that we work in. But taking some of the learning and some of the innovation and some of the speed and the kind of fleet-footedness of that and building it into future action. That's a very kind of broad challenge, but I don't know if anyone has any reflections, further reflections on that.
My only reflection on that is that we are doing 1 or 2 projects which are trying to capture this kind of behaviour during COVID so that we can identify those positive behaviours and then in terms of organisations and relationships, getting things done, stuff, and amplify that going forward. So we are looking at it in a sort of an evaluation type mode. One of the projects, for example, I'm working on is around, and then we're nearly finished, is around homelessness. And of course, there was a big thing that happened with with homelessness during COVID. But it wasn't just the fact that homeless people or rough sleepers were put into hostels and hotels. It was everything around that as well. All of the response to their immediate needs and everything. It was all just done, you know, but it wasn't all just done really well across the country. There was a lot of variation as well. So, but definitely, and that's just one little example. It happened across the board, didn't it?
Yeah, that's really nice. Thanks for sharing, Rachel. So we were just going to say thanks a lot from our side for everyone that attended and for contributing in the chat box. We'd love for you to kind of keep in touch with us. So I'll post our email address on the chat box. And if you have any kind of feedback for us going forward, then do let us know.
Mimi, thank you very much. Also, Matilda and Jenna, very kindly giving your time to join in our festival. And we look forward really to seeing all that can come from the Anchor Learning Network. Tremendous opportunities, great timing, and massive potential. So we're really keen to see that thriving in the new year. So thank you very much again for today. I know Janine is about to round up, but Peter, you've appeared in video. Was there a reflection you wanted to offer too?
Oh, I was just going to comment on one of the what previous speaker was saying, just about the kind of how do we retain this kind of the heady days of let's just get on and do things. And I was just writing something in the chat box about, because I think we do have to recognise that there was a context for that. We do hear everyone saying it, but that there were a few bits of the context, 2 of which were we were allowed to suspend being concerned about money, and we were allowed to suspend being concerned about regulation. And I think those 2 things are no longer suspended. So I think to some extent, we probably need to work a bit harder at unpacking what it was that allowed people to make rapid decisions, and what elements of the context can realistically be continued and which can't, and then think about how to retain the value.
Great, thank you. Janine, over to you.
It's bang on 5 o'clock, so a really quick wrap up. A massive thank you to all of our speakers. It's been a really interesting and informative presentation, and it sounds as though there will be plenty of opportunity to follow this conversation up going forward, particularly through the network that you're planning to establish. So do keep in touch, do yes, do follow this up, and thank you so much for such a great presentation.